topic today is 3 years after Taliban governance, the way forward in Afghanistan. We have three speakers. The first is Mr. Richard Bennett, the UN Special Rapporteur, and we would like him to speak on his observations on the current human rights situation in Afghanistan under the Taliban governance. Then we have Belkis Ahmadi. We'd like her to speak on gender apartheid and its impact on Afghan women. And then we have Mohammed Abdul Ahrar Ramzipur, and we'd like him to speak of the role of human rights defenders and civil society on advocacy and accountability. So I will call on Mr. Richard Bennett, but just to very few words, because we can talk for an hour on him and what he has done. I knew him from Amnesty International when we were very young, Richard. But now he is the special rapporteur on the human rights situation in Afghanistan. He was in Afghanistan also with UNAMA and worked as the chief of the Human Rights Service at that point. He's been working on many issues with regard to Afghanistan. He also was with many UN peacekeeping missions as a human rights advisor in Sierra Leone, Timor-Leste, and South Sudan, among others. And he he was the representative of the High Commissioner in Nepal and head of the OHCHR office there. And for the region, we must know that he was the chief of staff with regard to the panel of experts and who wrote the report on Sri Lanka, which had such important consequences. He began life in Amnesty International, like many people of our generation. And at the moment, he is currently a visiting professor at Raoul Wallenberg Institute in Lund, Sweden. So, Richard, please go ahead.
Thank you, Radhika, for your very kind, flattering introduction. I just want to check, can everyone hear me? It's okay? Good. First of all, it's such a pleasure to join you and an honor. And I was so delighted when Fahim and with Palwasha reached out to ask me today if I would join this meeting, because the region has such an important role to play in Afghanistan, and especially human rights defenders in the region. And here we're talking about South Asia. This is often said. I'm not sure that the Taliban necessarily listen to any of us, including in the region, but I think your voices are important. And I do think that the international community may listen more to voices from the region. I also appreciate the subject, the way forward after 3 years of Taliban governance. And to let you know that on Monday, I'll be at the Human Rights Council giving an update, and I think, 6 minutes or something. So you're my guinea pigs. I'll give you a dry run of more or less what I might say to the council. Perhaps beginning by saying that there is little room for optimism about the future from a human rights perspective, and especially from the perspective of women and girls, or indeed minorities, or in fact, anyone who does not agree with the ideology of the de facto authorities in Afghanistan these days. What I think we've observed, or at least I have, is that the repression of human rights, especially women and girls, under the Taliban now for 3 years, is incremental. It's step by step tightening the grip. And it's not as if it was on day one. In fact, on day one or shortly after, the Taliban were trying to convince us that they were a 2.0, a new version, spruced up for the 2020s, with promises not to close schools, at least for long, and the issuance of a general amnesty towards those who were fighting against them, and many others. But I think over time, what we've seen is a change, and that their rhetoric is not the same as it was. And in fact, when it first started, we thought that their rhetoric, that there was a gap between their words and their actions. There's not so much of a gap now, actually, and that's not a positive thing, because their words have become more harsh, more exclusive, more based around national sovereignty. And I think this is probably in line with the trend internationally, but particularly noticeable in Afghanistan. I made my last report to the Council in June. That report was requested to be an analysis of the situation for women and girls. I did that, and I analyzed that the Taliban's closing of space and its widespread segregation, discrimination, and exclusion of women and girls could amount to international crimes, including crimes against humanity, particularly gender persecution and other forms of persecution. And that also that, that there should be, to address this, an all-tools approach, that the UN and others need to use all the tools at its disposal to bring about accountability and to try and redress this. I also referred to the issue of gender apartheid, and I know that Belkis will focus on this today. And it's not my place, and I'm so pleased that Ramispour Saib is going to speak to focus perhaps more on the issues of the Taliban's defense, that they are merely invoking Islamic Sharia and Afghan traditions. Recently, just 2 weeks ago, the Taliban introduced their latest law empowering their Ministry for the Prevention of Vice and Propagation of Virtue. And this law kind of entrenches and embeds a lot of the edicts that have been introduced previously, placing restrictions on women, but goes further step. For example, with regard to no longer allowing women's voices to be heard in public, requiring mahram for even short journeys, but also beyond the crackdown on women and girls, it has it will impact on other groups, basically all Afghans, on religious minorities, ethnic minorities, marginalized communities like the LGBTI community, men and boys too, because of the strict rules on men's clothing, length of beard, and these kind of issues as well. I don't want to speak too long, but summarizing, I think I would say that, and I began that there is a increasing crackdown on rights and freedoms, and little evidence of any movement in the contrary direction, and perhaps strong signals that the situation may get worse before it gets better. In this respect, I noted in my June report, and I'll mention again now, that the regime and its policies have long-term intersectional and intergenerational implications. Afghanistan has one of the world's youngest populations, and I'm especially concerned about the protection of children and children's rights. And Radhika, I know that you have spent a lot of your career on this issue as well. Civil society, civic space has been closed a great deal. The Taliban silences any dissenting voices, be they from human rights defenders or from journalists. And the oppressive policies and human rights violations perpetuate a climate of fear and repression that affects every segment of Afghan society. Let me kind of wrap up by looking forward a little bit. Where are their possibilities? In this regard, while I don't see much opportunity for change amongst the hardline Taliban, I do think that the international community has been falling short and, amongst other things, doing a disservice to all victims and survivors, especially women and girls. This is because the international community lacks coherence, it lacks unity, it lacks a vision, it lacks a plan. And this, I believe, is being exploited by the Taliban. Their strengths are the international community's weaknesses. They have an ideology. They have been successful in implementing it. They believe in themselves. They're, if anything, overconfident, because I think that they should be neither underestimated, but also not overestimated either. And the international community has none of those things. It doesn't have a plan. It doesn't have coherence, and it has no confidence in what it's doing either, in my view. We did see the beginnings of something when the Security Council requested an independent assessment of the international community's response, and a report was made by the special coordinator in November last year, and was actually noted positively in a Security Council resolution 2721, which asked the Secretary General to appoint a special coordinator to lead the more cohesive international response. But I think with the meetings that have taken place in Doha with special envoys, and especially the most recent meeting at the end of June, early July, which included the Taliban, but excluded civil society and women, that a message was sent to the Taliban that they can continue to crack down on human rights and the rights of women and girls especially, and there will be no consequences. This is a shortfalling by the international community, in my view. I am in favor of dialogue with the Taliban, but without a real plan and unity, and also, I will add, little or no admission of by the international community of its responsibility for the situation that Afghans find themselves in now, I am not particularly optimistic. So I would propose 2 or 3 steps. I think it's important that there be an agreed upon cohesive plan. I think, second, that any normalization of engagement with the de facto authorities must be based on demonstrable, measurable, and independently verifiable, verified improvements and human rights. As mentioned, I recommend an all-tools approach, using everything at its disposal, from the High Commissioner, special procedures, treaty bodies, and especially those tools like the ICC and possibly the ICJ in respect of Afghanistan, and maybe new tools like gender apartheid that will be referred to later. No single tool, in my view, will be sufficient to remedy this dire situation. And dire it is, but it's not getting publicity. So thanks again to SAR for devoting this discussion to Afghanistan. We need to push hard to show that the people of Afghanistan are suffering, and especially the women and girls. I'd finally like to pay tribute to the determination of Afghan people to continue standing up for their rights. And I will continue to call on the international community to support them even more strongly than it's done so far, and especially through practical actions. Many Afghans say that condemnation of the Taliban's policies are deserving, but they are not sufficient. Action is needed. And then finally, this is not only about the Taliban or even of ISKP. Afghanistan suffered 4.5 decades of conflict. Some people would say that is not over yet. There have been human rights violations committed by all parties to the conflict over decades. That should be addressed. It needs accountability in its broadest transitional justice sense, needs to be introduced. That should not start from August 2021. It needs to look at the root causes of where Afghanistan has found itself, has ended up now. And so I do think this conversation needs to be broadened to understand the history and the complexity of Afghanistan's culture, religions, and peoples, and move forward based on respect for human rights, including inclusiveness of all Afghans. So, thank you very much. I'll give the floor back to you, Radhika.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's very useful, especially the aspects about the failure of the international community to really help and the need to engage them in the way forward. I'd like to give the floor now to Belkis Ahmadi. Belkis has had over 20 years of experience on issues related to gender, human rights, and civil society, democracy in Afghanistan. She has been with US Aid at the most senior levels and has been involved in programming, training, mentoring. And she has also published extensively on issues relating to democracy, governance, and women's rights in Afghanistan. She has given leadership and oversight to many projects. And one of the interesting things she has done is also work on the personal law system in Afghanistan, which has major consequences for women. So I'll just call on Balkis to step in.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Radhika, Diksha, and the entire Sahar team for inviting me for this crucial and timely discussion on the situation of Afghan women and the impact of the Taliban's gender apartheid regime on women. It's always an honor to be on the same panel with Special Envoy Bennett and Mr. Ramespour. Since taking control, the Taliban have issued 200 edicts, circulars, orders, and instructions at national and provincial levels that infringe upon human rights, with 121 as of yesterday, specifically targeting or referencing women and girls. These directives impact every aspect of a woman's life, systematically stripping away their rights and freedoms. The rights that Afghan women fought so hard to secure access to education, employment, and participation in public life. To provide some context, I think it's important to note that Afghan women have been striving for progress since the early 20th century. The advancements that I'm about to briefly highlight did not begin in 2001, as many in both the West and East mistakenly believe. Afghan women's journey towards emancipation started long before the US invasion or intervention following 9/11. Afghan women gained the right to vote in 1919. That's 1919. Women's rights and gender equality before the law were enshrined in the constitutions in 1923 and reaffirmed in the 1964 and 1973 constitutions, and most recently in the 2004 constitution. Women were elected to the parliament and held cabinet positions as early as in the 1960s. After 2001, before the Taliban took control just 2 years ago, women made up 25% of the Afghan parliament. Out of 320 seats in the parliament, 89 were held by women. In the government, they served as ministers, deputy ministers, they served as diplomats. In fact, there were 111 female diplomats, including ambassadors. They were judges, lawyers, prosecutors, and so on. So now what has happened in the past 3 years? The first thing they did was obviously declare the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, the same title that they used in the 90s. Suspended the constitution and all other legislations and policies that were in place to protect women's rights, including the law on the elimination of violence against women. Abolished institutions and mechanisms that provided protection against gender-based violence, such as Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission, Ministry of Women's Affairs, Commission to Eliminate Violence Against Women, and shelters and safe houses for victims of domestic violence. They also replaced the Ministry of Women's Affairs with the Ministry for the Propagation of Virtue and Prevention of Vice. It's known for its notorious record of suppressing women's rights. So the Ministry of Vice and Virtue is one of the most powerful arm of the Taliban's government. Some of the policies that have been either issued or enforced by the Vice and Virtue include ban on education, ban on employment with government, ban on employment with the UN and governmental organizations, banning women from going to parks, playing sport, running businesses such as hair and beauty salons and so on. They have regulated or imposed head-to-toe cover. For those of you who have been to Afghanistan, you know that Afghan women are modestly dressed to begin with, all the time. As if the situation wasn't already dire, on July 10th, as Richard just mentioned, the Taliban issued a new decree that imposes even stricter limitations on women. This decree, the new one, outlines the expanded duties and responsibilities of the Vice Virtue inspectors or the moral police, granting them unprecedented control over nearly every aspect of women's life, both in public and also in private. The decree not only empowers the moral police, but also gives them the discretion to determine the punishment for any perceived violations under ta'zir or disciplinary punishments. Speaking of punishment, since November 2022, when they reenacted the qisas, hudud, and ta'zir punishments, 854 people, including 129 women, have been subjected to public lashing. The majority of these women who have been subjected to public lashing and imprisonment have been accused of running away from home or not fully complying by the Taliban's mahram and hijab requirements. So now specifically to the question of gender apartheid and whether the Taliban's policies fall within the definition of apartheid as used in the South Africa case. I'm doing a very brief comparison because I know that there are many still in the West and the East believe that the Taliban's policies do not as apartheid. So here is the thing. In 1948, South Africa's all-white government intensified the enforcement of segregation policies, targeting non-white populations that were the Black population as well as Asians and colored population. In the government, there was no place for anyone other than the all-white. So let's now see what the Taliban have done. In 2021, when they formed their government, they formed an exclusive Taliban government, upholding their radical interpretation of Islam and deeply conservative views regarding women and girls. Girls and women make 50% of the country's population. Just like in South Africa, the Black population made the majority of the population. Okay, unemployment. In South Africa, the primary goal of the white rulers was to exploit non-white populations as a source of seasonal, cheap, and abundant labor for farms, mines, and other industries, while retaining full economic and political control for themselves. In Afghanistan, what the Taliban have done, well, first to begin, female judges, lawyers, and prosecutors are fully banned from practicing law. Women are barred from holding decision-making roles within NGOs. No woman is permitted as heads of organizations or in director-level positions. In the few places where women are allowed to work, for example, education, health sector, and some administrative roles in some governments, offices are segregated by gender, with women and men working in separate spaces. Within the healthcare system, female and male healthcare providers are not allowed to meet or work together. Okay, on access to education. The apartheid system in South Africa institutionalized educational inequalities through explicitly racist policies. I want to mention the Bantu Education Act that ensured that Black South Africans received only limited education, deliberately keeping them confined to the working class. Taliban are doing, girls have been banned from attending secondary schools, effectively denying them the opportunity for advanced education. Women have been barred from attending and teaching at universities. Before the complete ban on women's university education that was issued in December of 2022, institutions or educational institutions were ordered to segregate classrooms and also prohibited women from studying agriculture, mining, civil engineering, veterinary medicine, and journalism. Now, on access to public spaces. In South Africa, the apartheid regime had placed signs reading whites only in public spaces, and including in park benches. What the Taliban are doing, women have been banned from accessing parks, gyms, and historic sites. Women are barred from playing sports, prohibited from using public baths, prohibited from using public transportation without a mahram, that's a male blood relative. On freedom of mobility, in South Africa, non-whites were prohibited from entering certain public spaces. Warning signs in some areas read, danger, natives, Indians, and colors. Entering these premises at night will result in being declared missing. Armed guards shoot on sight, and savage dogs will devour the remains. What Taliban are doing, women are required to remain at home unless accompanied by a mahram and unless they have a legitimate reason to be outside their homes. Women are compelled to wear head-to-toe hijab in all public spaces. Women are barred from using public transportation, as I said before, and they're forbidden from traveling outside the country without a mahram. Briefly on access to health services, under the apartheid regime, a range of laws and policies was implemented to enforce racial discrimination against Black Africans, which obstructed the population's access to healthcare services. Under the Taliban, health clinics and hospitals are instructed not to accept female patients unless accompanied by a mahram. In some areas, the vice and virtue inspectors, they barge into even the operation theater in hospitals and clinics to make sure that gender segregation is followed. Right to engage in politics and freedom of assembly. Under the apartheid, the South African government imposed severe restrictions on freedom of assembly, particularly targeting political organizations. Under the Taliban, women are prohibited from participating in public demonstrations and gatherings. Those who attempt to protest are subjected to detention, torture, and sexual violence while in custody. And their male family members also face intimidation. I'm not going to go to to freedom of expression and so on. By now, you have a full picture of what's going on in Afghanistan. So in conclusion, the Taliban's policies not only violate the fundamental human rights of women, they inflict deep psychological and emotional harm. They have stripped women of their dignity, autonomy, and sense of self-worth, leading to increased rate of depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues. Advocates for, those who advocate for inclusion of gender apartheid in the draft Convention on Crimes Against Humanity argue that the persistent and systematic exclusion and discrimination against women and girls in Afghanistan by the Taliban represent a profound violation of human rights. Such practices, what Taliban are doing is that breach the UNHCR, UN Human Rights Charter or Declaration, and it also undermines the principles of equality and non-discrimination. The Taliban's policies demonstrate a clear and form of institutionalized oppression. I'll stop here and we'll come back to answering any questions, but I hope I have now painted a full and clear picture of how the Taliban's policies compare with the South Africa's apartheid regime. Thank you.
Thank you, Balkis. We're really the horror that is going on for women in Afghanistan, something that is really terrible, and of course for making the case that this should be seen as apartheid under the convention. It's very interesting and very persuasive. Now let me call on Professor Mohammed Abdul Ara Ramizpour. He was a lecturer at Kabul University, but he has also been educated at Birmingham and Nottingham University. And he was, for a great part of his life, linked to UNAMA and was a human rights officer at UNAMA, actively engaging with Afghan civil society and human rights defenders, medias, etc. At the moment, he's the president of the World Anti-Extremism Network, a new global organization based in Canada, and he works closely with Afghan civil society and human rights defenders. And we look forward to his presentation on human rights defenders. Thank you. I give you the floor.
Thank you, Radhika, dear chair of the panel and dear esteemed colleagues. I'm grateful to Mr. Fahim Hakim and also Palbasha John, who reached to me and invited me to this platform, and particularly in this significant webinar. It is an honor to join you, particularly our distinguished colleague, Mr. Richard Bennett, and also me in this webinar, 3 years after the Taliban governance, the way forward. I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss the vital role of Afghan civil society in human rights defenders, in advocacy, in accountability. Actually, since the Taliban regained the power on August 15, 2021, most Afghan human rights defenders and civil society activists, they have fled to other countries. And they didn't sit there silent. They established their organizations, they remanaged their advocacy activities in exile. And over the past 3 years, we also have been witnessing rising of a new human rights, women rights defenders group, the group of women rights activists involved in the past in studying or working in government or private sectors. We call them women protesters. They started their advocacy for their rights. They came out on the streets, but unfortunately, in the early days of Taliban takeover, they suppressed their movements, and they changed nowadays their advocacy methods. Nowadays, we should count them a big part of human rights defenders who are actively engaged inside the country on advocacy for their rights. During the past 3 years, Afghan human rights defenders and civil society activists have persisted in their works through different ways, using different mechanisms and initiatives. I would like to have a very brief glance on these initiatives carried out by Afghan human rights defenders and civil society in the past 3 years. Information sharing. Information sharing was the initial step or the initial initiative of Afghan human rights defenders, despite of the restrictions, censorship, security challenges. They have tried to reach out through their personal channels, using social media, secret channels, communicating with relevant international stakeholders who they believe that they can echo their voices through different mechanisms globally to the relevant international human rights organizations. Secondly, they carried out a range of advocacy initiatives by taking part in the UN events. For instance, Afghan civil society activists, particularly women rights activists, they took active part in the Security Council sessions, General Assembly, in the Human Rights Council sessions, and their participation somehow supported by some global human rights institutions. And they echoed the voice of Afghan communities through these stages. They played a very significant role during this period. And also, they have tried to advocate through social media and also international media, and also through their participation in diverse international channels. A few Afghanistan-connected channels also played a very significant role for advocacy of human rights for Afghan civil society and human rights defenders. Capacity building on human rights. Afghan HRDs and civil society groups, they realized that since most of the civil society and human rights activists have fled Afghanistan, they wanted to somehow do something to fill the gap of lacking or leaving human rights defenders from Afghanistan. They started online training courses, and during the last 2 years, a number of online educational courses on human rights somehow carried out by the human rights defenders and civil society for women, girls, and young people inside the country. Research and reporting. It was another task that carried out by HRDs in exile and civil society activists. Some global institutions, they played a very significant role in this regard. For instance, the Raoul Wallenberg Institute in Sweden, some universities in some other parts of the world, in Europe, the US, the UK, they also engaged in providing some situations, some opportunities for Afghan scholars to do research on human rights. A number of papers have been released in the past 3 years on different topics on human rights. Documentation. Beside of reporting and sharing information on violence of human rights, documentation was another important part of human rights defenders in exile. We can mention the names of some institutions like Saremo, Rawadari, Afghan Witness, and some others. They engage actively on documentation of human rights violence, despite all challenges they have in terms of resources, in terms of safety and security of their networks inside Afghanistan. They could provide good reports during the last 3 years. Educational initiatives by civil society for women and girls. Beside of human rights training courses, they have tried to provide some opportunities for education, particularly for those they couldn't continue their education due to the condition imposed by Taliban on education in Afghanistan. Establishing networks. HRDs, Afghan HRDs, civil society activists, they started establishing new organizations, creating new networks. We can name, for instance, HRD Plus in Europe. A large group of Afghan HRDs, they came together and they established the HRD Plus, a very well-known, very active group of human rights defenders. They actively engaged in advocacy through media and also taking part in a number of sessions and OSCHR gatherings, including the Security Council sessions, the Human Rights Council sessions. We can mention Rawadari, a new organization leading by a very well-known active human rights defender, and also SRMO, another organization supporting human rights defenders and providing trainings on safety mitigation in different parts and different issues of human rights. Training workshops, technical training workshops on documentation. Some organizations global organizations, particularly Raoul Wallenberg Institute, and also MDERA and others. They provided some opportunity for a big group of human rights defenders to learn how to document human rights violence. It's a very technical, skillful training sessions. It started and it's continuing. Soon we will have a good session of this in-person training in Canada, where I hope Mr. Richard and some other colleagues also will join us on that. A global campaign on the recognition of gender apartheid. It was another initiative. Somehow it started in recent months, and a number of HRDs, particularly women rights HRDs, they actively engaged in this issue, and it's going very well, despite all challenges and also difficulties they are facing. They are looking for moral, political, and technical support. Particularly, they are looking to get the acceptance and support of Security Council member states and very big other stakeholders to support this initiative. But after having a look on all these initiatives, that somehow most of these initiatives and activities connecting to advocacy and to documentation of human rights, despite part of them are capacity building and awareness raising, things like that. But the question is that what was the impact of all these initiatives and efforts by Afghan human rights defenders and civil society activists on the approach of Taliban towards human rights? If we ask this question, if you look on all these efforts, if we compare it with the reaction by Taliban, the denial of Taliban on all these efforts and research and recommendations and demands of Afghan people, the answer is zero. The answer somehow resounding zero, nothing, unfortunately. And today, as we discussed the role of human rights defenders and civil society in advocacy, we must acknowledge three events in the past 3 months that somehow obstructed participation of Afghan HRDs. In one of the major events happened, and in June, the Doha third meeting, Afghan HRDs, Afghan civil society representatives somehow prevented to participate in that event. Secondly, banning of Mr. Richard, the special rapporteur of UN for human rights in Afghanistan, from visiting Afghanistan. It was the second negative approach of Taliban in the last 3 months. The third, as Bilkis John has mentioned about the propagation of virtue and prevention of vice law. It's not the law, it's just a document released by Taliban. I personally, as a lawyer, it's difficult for me to look it as the law and to see it as a law. This is just a document, like other documents, more than 200 documents released by Taliban in the past 3 years, restricting fundamental rights of Afghan people. It was like another official stamp of Taliban on their policies, systematic policies against human rights in Afghanistan. Another point I would like to add is that, unfortunately, while the Taliban have full access on financial resources, natural resources of the country, and also somehow there is allegations about misusing of international communities' humanitarian aid to Afghanistan, particularly those $80 million reaching to on weekly basis for their own political agenda, for their own supporting measures for their own members, in using of radicalizing the society establishing thousands of madrasas, educating extremism and radicalism for Afghan youths, and expanding their ideological territory by supporting and connecting to other terrorist and extremist groups in the region. If you look on the opposite side, unfortunately, Afghan HRDs, they are lacking support, they're lacking technical support, financial support, and they don't have adequate supporting resources for their initiatives, for their activities. For 10,000 or 20,000 fund, they have to knock many doors. They have to write several proposals. They have to communicate with different donors. It's a very difficult situation for Afghan human rights defenders. Indeed, it was a very generous support of international community by supporting the evacuation process and the resettlement of large number of HRDs to other parts of the world, but still they are lacking adequate support. I think this is the proper time that after 3 years, the international community and human rights organization, they have to reconsider their advocacy strategies and provide the necessary support to Afghan human rights defenders. This support could be included like initiating human rights dialogue among regional human rights defenders. Since we are discussing this issue right now in a platform in the South Asia, I think launching a dialogue between human rights defenders in the region, since a number of the regional countries, they are Islamic countries, with presence of somehow enlightened religious scholars to discuss the current Taliban's policies they are imposing on Afghan people by the name of Sharia, like the law of what mentioned Ms. Bilkis right now. This is a kind of unique and dark interpretation and narrative of Islamic Sharia. It should be discussed. There should be support by international community in platforms like Sahar and others to help this dialogue. I think reviewing the current situation and developing effective strategies for advocacy and documentation of systematic human rights violations by the Taliban. We should review how we should enhance our capacity, how we should better do our job for documentation of human rights, to use these documentations in future through the international tribunes, through the international mechanisms like ICC and others, for convicting Talibans and other perpetrators of mass human rights violations in Afghanistan. I think coordination also very important, kind of coordination for strengthening relationship between regional human rights defenders and civil society activists, to encourage these civil society groups and human rights defenders in the region to bearing some pressures on their governments to stop normalization of political relation with the Taliban. And engagement with Taliban should be conditioned. I like what mentioned by Mr. Richard as conclusion that unfortunately the international community is lacking coherent. They are not united. There are different interests, different political agendas, unfortunately, even by some European countries. Some of them saying there are good Taliban and bad Taliban. Taliban is changeable. Dealing with Taliban is possible. Something like that. This is totally difficult. In the last 3 years, proved for us that Taliban will not change. It's very difficult. I think we have to also consider that large number of human rights defenders right now suffering in the neighboring countries, Pakistan, Iran, maybe some of them in Turkey still remain, some of them in India, maybe in some other regional countries. The civil society groups in these regions, I think this is a very crucial time. They have to advocate with their states to do not return these defenders forcibly to Afghanistan. This is not the right time for forced returning of these people to Afghanistan. They have to receive supports. Thank you very much. It was all from my side. I would be happy to answer your questions related to my topic. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think those who can put up their hands, but there's some questions on the chat. Shall I read them out? And first one is from Mary Akrani to everyone, but it says, "Dear Mr. Bennett, thank you for your continued dedication and support. In your opinion, what do you foresee as the next steps? How much longer do you think we as Afghans will have to wait for the international community to hold the Taliban accountable?" Go ahead, Richard.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry, next steps and timeline for holding the Taliban accountable. I talked a little bit about the all tools approach that I'm promoting. I know that for a number of years, the International Criminal Court has been investigating the situation in Afghanistan. I don't fully agree with their approach. The current prosecutor has decided to focus on the Taliban and ISKP. I have been making the point that all parties to the conflict committed violations and all should be held accountable. However, that is something regarding the ICC. I believe they need to deliver something to Afghan victims. I think also need to be better at communicating with Afghan victims. So I hope that their work is expedited and we see a practical outcome of their investigation. I know that they have are devoting considerable resources to it. And I think that could be something fairly quick, but done fairly soon. However, there's a long way to go between an indictment and a prosecution. That would be a lot further off. But an indictment would send, I think, a message to all groups, be they victims or in fact those indicted, that the international community is taking justice seriously in Afghanistan. I think as well, there's potential at the International Court of Justice for, this is a state-to-state process, whereby one or more states could challenge Afghanistan's respect for international human rights treaties, in this case, CEDAW. And I understand that is under consideration seriously now. The whole case would take quite a long time, but the provisional measures that the ICJ can direct may sometimes are quite quick. They can be in a matter of weeks, as we've seen in other situations. There are a lot of other things. Documentation is extremely important, and my mandate as special rapporteur, I've actually got a specific preserve and document mandate, a document and preserve of human rights violations. This is a bit different from most rapporteurs. It's a little bit more like a commission of inquiry, which our chair is very familiar with. And as a result of that, I've got a bigger team than usual, still not big enough. But we are getting on with that important documentation. There are the possibility of universal jurisdiction. That is the application of international criminal law by other states. So we have seen a few cases involving Afghanistan, a couple in the Netherlands, one in the UK, but there could be a lot more. And I also feel that there should be more reflections by states who are involved in Afghanistan about their own conduct. We've only really seen Australia move on this so far, which did conduct an inquiry, did conclude that Australian soldiers murdered, in fact, 39 Afghans, and there is one prosecution ongoing there. We also, I think, need to look beyond criminal accountability. There are other forms of accountability in the broad basket of transitional justice, be they truth, which is extremely important, reparations to victims and communities, memorialization, and some Afghan groups like ARDO, AHRDO, are doing very good work on that. Now, time frame. I've indicated some time frames, but it is a long process. And it's a very frustrating process, especially for Afghans. All of you are basically victims. And I can't really provide much good news on that, how long it will take. 3 years already seems like a long time. In some other conflict situations, I'm afraid, has taken much longer than that, even decades or generations. It's a sad situation. We should not take any pressure off. In fact, put on more pressure. And I think the Taliban need to, what we call, feel the pinch. They need to feel a bit of pain. I don't think they are feeling any now. I feel that they consider that they won the fight, they won the war, they won the negotiations with the US, and they're super confident, and they're plowing on regardless. And they are getting no pushback. So I think the best form of accountability, or the most hopeful at the moment, is if and when others, especially those in the international community, say, enough, this is a red line. We are not going to accept anything more. They will use every possible way to avoid that. For example, the whole humanitarian argument, that basically that there is a risk of humanitarian catastrophe, to keep on engaging with the international community. And I'm not against providing humanitarian support to the people of Afghanistan, but at the moment we are also emboldening the Taliban with it. And I believe that, and I mentioned it already, that the process that started in Doha could have served, as Mr. Ramispour mentioned, to have emboldened them with recent moves that they've taken to crack down. To be frank, I'm not surprised that they have now banned my visits. In fact, not many special rapporteurs these days have access to the countries they're responsible for. Not Myanmar, not Iran, not North Korea. In fact, in Asia, only Cambodia now. That doesn't stop us doing our work. It is advantageous to have access, but it's not essential. I think they've made a mistake. They seem to be claiming that my reports are not accurate, calling me spreading propaganda. Now, so my request back to all of you is, please review my reports and tell me if I've made mistakes, if they're not accurate. I'm human. My team is human. We might make mistakes, but we do everything possible using UN credible methodologies to ensure that the facts are verified. And so I would like, when the Taliban claim that it's propaganda, for others, all of you in civil society, other UN agencies, and member states, to say that the reports that I make are credible and are in line with other information being received, and they didn't consider that they are well documented and verified. Sorry, I went beyond the question, but I took the floor. I took the liberty of doing that. Back to you, Radhika.
Yes, thank you. Just since we're on accountability, that's the next question is, what about what happened before 2021? accountability for what happened before 2021.
Is that for me?
Yes.
If so, yeah, I've said that. I've been repeating that. I agree. How can any of us, including me, go to a survivor or the families of victims and say, and ask the question, were the violations against you or your family before or after 2021? And if it's before 2021, I will say, sorry, we don't have the mandate to pursue that. That is not just unfair, it's selective justice. So I think you know my views on that.
Okay. So the same person, Alvita Majumdar, I think this is really directed on women's issue. The issue she asks, the issue of women's rights is desperate and urgent, but isn't the overwhelming focus on a single issue? There are other concerns as well, inadequate, both in terms of a more broad-based rights approach, humanitarian lens, and even in terms of strategy. So I think the apartheid response, maybe if you can talk to her, this is central. Maybe we can have that discussion. Perhaps you can respond, Melissa. Can you respond? Yeah.
Yes, and I was going to go to the next question as well, if you would allow me.
Sure.
What the South Asian countries can do.
Yes.
I just jotted down a few points. One
Okay.
is to extend moral, technical support to women and to Afghan male allies of women's rights. Put pressure on your governments to use their leverage with the Taliban, as well as countries who are friendly with the Taliban. Join in and support calls for codification of gender apartheid. Support Richard's mission and also amplify his reports, as well as the voices of Afghan women in your capitals. Do not underestimate the power of your own capitals and your power holders. So I think that's very important. And in the meanwhile, talk to your educational institutions, provide online scholarships as well as in-person scholarships to Afghan men and women who are now living in a limbo in your countries or as refugees. So now specifically to the question regarding, let me read the question again and let Ramespur and Richard get to that question.
Right. So there's a lot of questions here as to why South Asia, what can the South Asians do? And not only the government, but also the human rights communities. So maybe we can, you've responded to that. Maybe we can ask Mr. Ramespur to, but the question one of them is asking is, should we focus on women's issue alone? So maybe Belkis can answer that.
Yes. So first off, human rights is indivisible. You cannot divide and say, well, this right is more important than that right. Yes, access to aid, to food, personal security, these are all fundamental rights that need to be supported. But here is the core problem. The Taliban's policies affect every aspect and single right of men and women. We, as Richard has been highlighting that in his report, yes, the situation of Afghan women are extremely dire. However, there are other issues as well. So we need to look at it as holistic, as a package. Women's rights situation is just so sickeningly violated by the Taliban that it's impossible not to focus, keep that as the top agenda and focus. Humanitarian aid is important, but let's also look at what's causing the humanitarian crisis right now. The unemployment, lack of governance experience by the Taliban. They know how to fight, they know how to kill people, they know how to destroy, but they do not have experience in governing. So that's why their violation of women's human rights need to be exposed by civil society groups, by governments. The South Asian, the very vibrant and strong and active civil society in South Asian countries can play a very important role in holding their own governments accountable for their action or inaction when it comes to human rights and women's rights in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you. And now maybe we can ask Mr. Ramizpur to just there are question after question as what is South Asian governments and human rights community can do. So maybe you could just respond to that.
Thank you, Radhika. As I mentioned in my points earlier, I think dialogue between human rights defenders in the region with Afghan human rights defenders in making them more closer to each other, to talk, to discuss, to analyze the situation, and to take a stance, joint stance against some issues like Bilkis mentioned, this gender apartheid issue. If we advocate more and get the consensus of regional human rights defenders, the states, by the support of these civil society groups, that will be great. That will be a good initiative. And also, as mentioned before, working only on women's rights or working on all human rights. This is a very important point. I think, unfortunately, most of the civil society groups and human rights defenders in Afghanistan and in exile, nowadays they are looking on the issue of gender apartheid. Indeed, it's a big part of our problem in Afghanistan and other societies, including our neighboring countries. But we should not focus only on one problem and ignore the rest. For instance, child rights. This is something, in my opinion, a little bit ignored or missed by human rights defenders, because there are some studies, and I was engaged on that earlier this year. There are a large number of cases against boys in Afghanistan. The culture of bachabazi, raping of boys, misuse of boys, smuggling of boys to other countries, slavery of boys. There are a number of issues. We have a long list of more than 23 problems we had before, and 4 or 5 other problems also added on that after the collapse of Afghanistan. Peoples or persons with disabilities. Afghanistan has a big number of disabled individuals. They are a big community. Unfortunately, in the past 3 years, the de facto authority, they mainly focus to support their own disabled individuals, their own communities. They couldn't cover the entire or the majority of the disabled community. This is something ignored or missed by human rights defenders. They have to focus on that a little bit more. And also the elderly. The problem of the elderly, this is another issue in Afghanistan right now. The de facto government stopped supporting the retirees, their payments, their salaries, their supporting aid. They're not receiving anything in the last 3 years. They are around 300,000 individuals, but they are the heads of their families. If you count their family, they are a big community, and they have to receive their rights. Indeed, these problems somehow reflected in Mr. Richard's report. We should not ignore that. He tried to do that, but I'm talking on human rights defenders. When they are looking on human rights issues, as Bilkis mentioned, they have to look that these rights are not divisible. They are connected to each other, and they have to focus on all. Regarding supporting Afghan women, Afghan girls by providing fellowships in the region, This is very good, very important, but stability also another challenge in our region. Look to Bangladesh. In recent problem or issues happened in Bangladesh. We have 600 Afghan girls studying in Bangladesh. They got a lot of concern. Still, they have concern, and they communicated with all stakeholders asking for their support. Stability is very important. When we are providing this kind of support in the region, we have to look also on the aftermath. We have to find proper ways to find proper solutions and sustainable solutions for these kind of challenges. Thanks.
So there are two questions. I give one to Richard and one to you, Professor Ramizpour. One is, it says, why are we not, basically, what about China and Russia? Shouldn't we be trying to get them on board and involve the regional countries, especially Russia and China, who are critical players in this whole process? And the second question, which I want to give Professor Ramizpour, is saying, it says that there a cycle throughout Afghan history, basically, the argument is that there's a center-periphery relationship, there's violence, and the periphery overwhelms the center at regular intervals. And so the question is, how sustainable do you think the existing regime is likely given this history? Now, I'm not aware of Afghan history. I'm just reading the question to you. Okay, Richard?
Thank you.
China and Russia.
Yeah, China and Russia. I think we need to take them a bit separately, even though they are forming because the history in Afghanistan is quite different. Russia, as the Soviet Union, has militarily intervened in and occupied Afghanistan. And so when I talk about accountability and I talk about all parties.
Oh dear.
The second is China has not done that. China has, however, a very strong policy of non-intervention and national sovereignty. And I think we've seen the Taliban begin to adopt some of the positions and language used by China. For example, now by saying that the issue of girls' education, or even rights of women and girls as a whole, or even human rights, is an internal matter. So different positions. But then Afghanistan is also part of a kind of geopolitics in what I guess some people might be calling a new Cold War. And there is therefore more of an alliance and using the geopolitics to bash the West, led by the US. And what we're seeing is a lot of paralysis and lack of action in the Security Council. For example, with regard to this new law, and I know Ramizpour doesn't like to call it a law, we can have that discussion another time, on the empowering of the Vice and Virtue Ministry. The Security Council could not come to an agreement on making a statement. I've heard there may be some movement by some Security Council members to have a press stakeout, but there was no agreement by China and Russia to sign up to a statement condemning the impact on all Afghans, but particularly women and girls of that. So yeah, I think, so I saw another question about Gaza, if I may just jump in with that as well, because it's in the same category of international politics. And yeah, I'm upset and troubled by what's happening, of course, in Gaza itself and the West Bank, but also the impact that the questioner raised on respect for the international legal and human rights order, including the ICC and the ICJ. I think it's a bit too early to judge that there will not be consequences in those bodies, but I do see that we are weakened when we call on the Taliban to take action, and they call it out as double standards. Even just a few days ago at the OIC, Organization of Islamic Conference, the Taliban acting foreign minister was allowed to speak, which is kind of interesting. And the last part of his speech was on this issue, Gaza. I think those involved in that, in supporting that conflict, in supporting Israel particularly, maybe should pay more attention to what I presume are unintended global consequences of what they're seeing. And just to mention, I'm not the special rapporteur for that part of the world, and I'm not supposed to sign on to things, but I did find 3 occasions where I have signed on to statements with other special procedures mandate holders on the very concerning situation in Gaza.
Okay, one other interesting question, I think Balkis can answer that, is, okay, Taliban's position on women, we know, but what about the other Afghan parties? Are they supportive?
Yes. Let's remember that the Taliban have banned all political parties in Afghanistan. So there is no such a thing as active political opposition inside Afghanistan to the Taliban. But from what I'm seeing, what Taliban are doing does not fit in any sane human beings' ideology and conduct. Everyone that I know is opposed to the Taliban's policies vis-a-vis women and in general on human rights. Because the Taliban have full control of the country, and because of the regional and some international communities' behavior with the Taliban have been given this false power that they believe that they are above the laws everywhere. But I can tell you for sure that women's rights organizations, human rights, civil society, and all Taliban opposition groups, they're in agreement that without inclusion, power sharing, without respect for human dignity, Afghanistan is not going to be stable. And if Afghanistan is not stable, its region is not going to be stable. We all have our differences. Come on, look at your own countries. Do you think every single person in your population have the same ideology and approach? Approaches are different, but the overall objective for non-Taliban are the same. Afghans have been through so much pain, deceit, and betrayal over the years by their neighbors, by the regional countries, and by the international community. So it definitely affects them, who they trust and who they don't trust. But overall, I think they're getting together, they understand the severity of the situation in Afghanistan, and from what I'm witnessing, they are ready to put their personal interest aside and work together or separate ways for the good of the Afghan people. Thank you.
Thank you. I told them I would stop this at 7:30. So one last question, Professor, perhaps to Professor Ramizpour, which is basically about Afghan immigrants, especially the ones in the neighboring countries. What can be done for them? And it's the international community. We talk a lot about what's going on in Afghanistan, but there's so many Afghan refugees and immigrants now all over the world, and should something be done for them?
Thank you, Radhika. Unfortunately, the issue of Afghan immigrants and Afghan refugees in neighboring countries, it's a very crucial issue nowadays, because both countries, Iran and Pakistan, they are forcibly returning Afghan refugees back. Last year, they somehow returned more than 500,000 Afghans to Afghanistan. Iran doing the same in daily basis, thousands of Afghan. Both countries somehow parties of the 1951 Refugees Convention. But unfortunately, they are not respecting the content of this convention, which says that any return of refugees should be voluntarily and should be with dignity. Unfortunately, even in Pakistan, the Pakistani authorities seized the goods and properties in livelihood staffs of families when they're returning to Afghanistan. And these returnees, when they are coming to Afghanistan, there is facing a lot of challenges. For instance, first of all, they are lacking proper education for their kids, particularly for their girls. Security also another challenge. Community challenges for their resettlement, because most of them returning to Afghanistan often 40 years, 50 years, long staying in Pakistan since they were there since the Cold War times, since the Soviet Union occupation in Afghanistan. This is a big challenge, and as I mentioned before, there is need for dialogue, for support, for advocacy. But unfortunately, politics plays its own things, and there are politics in the region. And also, I would like to add on the China and Russia. Both countries are, authoritarian regimes. The Iran, the same. These authoritarianism and also totalitarian regimes, they are not supporting human rights. They are not supporting any agenda for human rights in the Security Council. Unfortunately, both of Russia and China, they are members of the Security Council, and they can easily veto the rights of the rest of the Security Council members. We have seen this recently when Rosa Otunbaya, the special representative of UN, she had a briefing in the Security Council. She was expecting a resolution, but these two states, China and Russia, they didn't support that resolution in regard of this new law of the Taliban. However, we are facing challenges. We hope our unity, our collaboration, and further engagement of human rights defenders in the regions somehow reach out to a kind of consensus and more unity and effective approach to do something for Afghan human rights.
Thank you very much. It's now 7:30, so let me close the sessions. I want to thank Mr. Richard Bennett for really, I know you're very busy. Thank you very much for coming, and we really benefited from your presence. Belkis Hamadi, with your enormous knowledge of women and gender and the reality in Afghanistan. Thank you very much. And Professor Ramizpur, thank you very much for your extraordinary knowledge. And also, at least the first part of your presentation, I was quite inspired by all the things Afghan, though nothing has resulted, and the Taliban has ignored it, but at least one got a sense that the community is active, especially the ones living abroad. So wish you all the best and good luck in your mobilization. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Sahar meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you for
Thank
the
you.
opportunity.
Great to listen to you.
Thank you very
Have a
much.
great day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.